Hello everyone, welcome back. This is, I haven't done one in a while. This is Kings and Generals, How Did the Americans Turn the Tide Against the British? This is the fourth video in this series. I don't know if I'm gonna make this a two-part video. It's right at the 25-minute mark. I might just carry it into, yeah, it's right there. It'll just be one. We'll stop it at the 25-minute mark, it looks like. Before we get started, there's a thanks button on the channel. You can donate, you can request videos, and your name will be sponsored by for the video. You can still request videos, it just takes a little bit longer to get to. You can subscribe to the channel. If this kind of stuff you like, you can give a thumbs up, and then all else fails, just click that little thumbs up button. That helps me. I don't even know how this video is going to play out, but I'm here, so let's do it.
On November 16, 1776, British forces successfully stormed Fort Washington, bringing an end to Continental resistance in New York City. However, capturing New York brought British Commander-in-Chief William Howe no satisfaction. Despite numerous heavy defeats, the Continental Army, led by General George Washington, remained in the field. The rebel legislatures continued to defy British control, and resistance in the countryside was growing more intense. Even before the battles of Trenton and Princeton, flagging American resolve had been reinvigorated by Thomas Paine's latest pamphlet, The American Crisis. Consequently, Howe was increasingly aware that the campaign of 1777 had to be decisive and final. If the rebellion were not put down now, it wouldn't be put down at all. This video is made available for free thanks to our YouTube members and patrons. We fund our free content through our program. Back in Europe, Whitehall was growing anxious. Since the first protests had begun, the government had believed reports from royal governors that the American colonists were fundamentally loyal, and the opposition was a tiny minority. They'd clung to this belief despite mounting contrary evidence, undermining their entire war strategy. Meanwhile, the Whigs' opposition was growing bolder. William Pitt the Elder.
I think they stuck to it because they didn't believe that it was the masses. It was only a few that were, as the saying goes, a squeaky wheel gets the oil, or something like that, something to that effect. Squeaky wheel gets the oil. So they probably thought it's just the loudest ones that are causing the most problems. Everyone else is on board with us. But unfortunately, the squeaky wheel can't make other wheels squeak. But a very loud, brash, abrasive person talking bad on someone can convince others maybe that guy's got a point. Because the people who are dictating all these terms to us are way on the other side of the ocean. And that's what happened.
Had opposed the taxes from the start, and most Whigs and some Tories now agreed with him. Their opposition went nowhere, as King George III always sided with the Prime Minister Lord North and his hardline Tories. However, as the cost of the war mounted, pre-existing cracks among the Tories were widening, and North was feeling the pressure. To make matters worse, most of the European continent was cheering for Britain's defeat. Perfidious Albion had never been popular in Europe, but being an unreliable ally during the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War had left Britain diplomatically isolated. Additionally, America's protests were filled with Enlightenment rhetoric, which touched the hearts and minds of Europe's Enlightenment-educated elite, securing widespread support. The crown heads of Europe were more circumspect, as they weren't keen on revolution themselves, though they cheered it on since it was being inflicted upon Britain. The Declaration of Independence was a major turning point. It inflamed the passions of many Europeans, particularly young and professionally stalled officers, who began making their way to America to join the Continental Army. The most famous of these was Francis Marquis de Lafayette, who would serve alongside Washington. However, one of the first and most important European military men who joined the American cause was Poland-Lithuania's Tadeusz Kościuszko, who'd be commissioned as the Colonel of Engineers in October 1776 after seeking out and impressing Benjamin Franklin with his geometry skills.
I don't want to spoil this for anybody, but Marquis de Lafayette eventually dies. And, spoiler, one of the things that's really cool that I love talking about this is he's buried in Paris. I'd love to go there and pay my respects. He's buried in Paris. In his grave, surrounding him, is American soil. Now, I've heard that soil came from Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, because him and Washington, they're like father and son. They got along great. Now, I've heard that. I've also heard that it just came from like Washington, D.C. or whatever. Regardless. In his tomb, the grave was dug, and then American soil was put in. He was buried, and then American soil was put on top and kind of covered and encased him. And he wanted that because he wanted to be buried, or maybe it's he's buried and then American soil is put on top. Maybe that's what it is. But anyways, he wanted to be surrounded by his two loves. So he's buried in Paris, touching Paris soil with American soil on top, and I think that's awesome.
Meanwhile, Britain's Caribbean rivals were eager to profit from the war, both financially and strategically. All had been willing partners in breaking the Navigation Acts pre-war, and were now actively looking the other way as their traders helped supply the American cause, and their ports provided safe harbour to American privateers, which London protested. France, in particular, wanted to openly assist the Americans, but had its own problems to contend with that prevented it from doing so. King Louis XVI was eager to avenge France's humiliation in the...
I'm related to him. If you check my DNA video, I share a bloodline with him. So, I'm coming to France to reclaim the crown, just so everyone knows.
7 Years' War, but was billions of livres in debt, which France's medieval tax system already struggled to finance. Additionally, both his army and navy were still rebuilding themselves from their last defeat to Britain. France's foreign ministry had calculated in 1763 that France couldn't hold Quebec so long as the American colonies remained loyal to Britain, making American independence a French interest. When American agents began seeking material and diplomatic support in Europe, Foreign Minister Comte de Vergennes leapt at the opportunity. Working with Silas Deane, Vergennes began funneling supplies to the Continental Army through the Caribbean via the front company Rodrigue Ortelet et Compagnie. Vergennes ultimately wanted to ally with America, but needed them to prove themselves first. Congress had dispatched Benjamin Franklin to negotiate that very alliance in December 1776. However, this wouldn't go as Congress planned. Franklin didn't announce his intentions, nor make any moves towards Versailles. Instead, he waited. Franklin knew Vergennes wanted an alliance, but he also knew that other ministers opposed another war. Franklin understood how French courtly politics worked from his years as the colony's representative to Parliament. All Franklin needed to overcome any opposition was for French courtly society and the king to become interested enough in him for Louis to invite him to Versailles. Such an invitation would signal the king's support for him and the American cause. He was already popular in France for his scientific achievements, but that wasn't enough. Therefore, Franklin waited for Vergennes to make the first move, working the Parisian salon scene while cultivating an air of mystery that the French found irresistible. Across the Atlantic, planning for the spring campaign season was well underway. Having restored faith in the Continental Army with his victory at Trenton, General George Washington was rebuilding his army, now with 3-year enlistments, to avoid another manpower crisis. Having learned from New York that his soldiers were not yet able to stand toe-to-toe against British regulars, he instead planned a Fabian strategy of attacking British supplies and avoiding battle on even terms to keep the army intact. Meanwhile, in early December, Howe proposed a multi-pronged campaign to strangle the rebels to Secretary of State for America George Germain. 10,000 new troops would land at Newport, Rhode Island, and secure the New England coast. Another 10,000 would march up the Hudson to Albany, meeting a similarly sized army moving south from Canada. Howe would lead 8,000 men to strike at Philadelphia through New Jersey, leaving 5,000 to hold New York. The British believed that New England was the heart of the rebellion. Without New England's fire, the rest of the colonies would capitulate. However, by January, it was clear that London wouldn't provide the necessary troops. Even if they did, Howe had concluded that isolating New England would accomplish little. Even before Trenton, few loyalists were joining his army, despite a steady stream of them fleeing to New York. This, coupled with intense guerrilla activity in the New Jersey and New York countryside, demonstrated how dedicated the Americans were to the rebellion. Therefore, Howe decided his only option was to utterly destroy the Continental Army in open battle, and then capture Philadelphia. Any European nation would capitulate under those circumstances, and Howe expected the Americans would be no different. Thus, in late January, Howe informed Germain that he'd instead focus his campaign on taking Philadelphia. Meanwhile, eager for his own command and jealous of rivals Howe and Henry Clinton's success in New York, Major General John Burgoyne was in London proposing an alternate plan to Germain. His plan, approved on February 28th, was for Burgoyne to lead an army of 8,500 down Lake Champlain and take Fort Ticonderoga before moving down the Hudson River Valley. A force of 2,000 would move east from Lake Ontario down the Mohawk River. Howe was to move up the Hudson, and all three armies would meet at Albany. Then Germain made a critical mistake. He received Howe's revised plan on February 23rd and approved it as well. Burgoyne was still in London, but there's no evidence that Germain informed Burgoyne of Howe's plans, nor Howe of his role in Burgoyne's campaign. Letters sent by Howe to Germain, Burgoyne, and Quebec's governor, Major General Guy Carleton, make clear that he never seriously considered moving up the Hudson, and Germain didn't correct him as it was too late. This would prove disastrous. The two campaigns happened simultaneously. For clarity's sake, we will examine Howe's Philadelphia campaign first, before moving to Burgoyne. Howe intended to destroy the Continental Army before marching across New Jersey to Philadelphia, but Washington had other ideas. From April to June 1777, Howe attempted to draw Washington out of his defensive positions near Morristown and Middlebrook without success. In June, a feigned retreat into an ambush was thwarted by the Continental vanguard. Additionally, Kosciuszko's fortifications along the Delaware convinced Howe to attack by sea instead. The plan was to transport the main army of 17,000 on ships, as close as possible to Philadelphia. If the Continental Army tried to protect the city, they'd be crushed. If not, he'd take the city, then move out to find the Continentals as they came to its relief. Henry Clinton would remain in New York with a reserve force of 7,000, primarily consisting of Hessians and Loyalists, to assist either Howe or Burgoyne as necessary. This surprised Clinton, just returned from leave, who strongly objected. 7,000 soldiers was barely enough to hold the city, much less send support to another general. Given the distance, by the time he learned that either was in trouble, any relief force would arrive too late to meaningfully help. It'd be better to focus on one.
How can you have plans if you don't communicate those plans? Burgoyne wants to come over and he's like, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this and this, this. It's going to work. I'm going to send it to this guy, Germain. And Germain's kind of like, yeah, okay, sounds good. Now you have to send it to someone else. I think Burgoyne will probably do that. It's like, there has to be communication here, fellas. The plan doesn't work if one person doesn't even know the plan exists. What are we doing?
Campaign or.
And I'm not rooting for the British. Kind of sounds like I am. Come on, British, you can turn this around.
The other. Howe overruled Clinton and set sail on July 25th. Washington immediately learned of Howe's departure, but not his intended target. Suspecting another feint, he kept his troops in position near New York. It wasn't until Howe was spotted in Chesapeake Bay that Washington realized that his target was Philadelphia, and marched to meet him. It's unclear why Howe chose to sail up the Chesapeake rather than the Delaware, as it added a week to the voyage, during which he lost both soldiers and supplies to storms.
Maybe Washington could have come to Philadelphia So by going down here, maybe he was trying to send a signal like we're going to go to Baltimore. Or maybe he thought that Washington would come to Philadelphia and be prepared to like maybe cut them off here, maybe at Newcastle, and then his troops could get out and attack them from behind. I mean, it's all what ifs, right? We have no idea. We're just guessing.
After landing at Head of Elk in Maryland on August 25th, Howe spent another week foraging for supplies, while Washington's 15,000 men prepared a defensive position along Brandywine Creek between Howe and Philadelphia. Howe finally moved on September 3rd. On September 9th, he arrived at Kennett Square south of Brandywine. Washington had placed his best troops under Anthony Wayne and Nathaniel Greene to block Chad's Ford, with Pennsylvania militia covering Pyle's Ford to the south. The rest of the army under John Sullivan was positioned along the riverbank to the north. Once again, British scouting was better than Washington's, and Howe learned of unguarded fords 7 miles north of Washington's position, giving him the opportunity to repeat the Battle of Long Island. Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis would take roughly 9,000 men to flank Washington's right, while Hessian Lieutenant General Wilhelm von Knyphausen distracted Washington by attacking Chad's Ford with the remaining 6,800. The attack would take place on September 11th. At 5 a.m., Cornwallis began his flanking march, while Knyphausen advanced towards Chad's Ford. 4 miles from the ford, he ran into Washington's scouts. A sharp battle began around midday as the British forces pushed the Americans back. Meanwhile, Cornwallis was in position by 2 p.m. However, he paused to rest his exhausted soldiers, giving Washington's scouts enough time to discover the movement and warn the general. Washington ordered the right flank to turn and meet the attack. However, the Americans were still moving into position when the attack began at 4 p.m. The center and the right divisions repelled the initial attack, but the leftmost division had yet to fully form up, and was instantly routed by the British Guard Brigade. Hessian Jaegers flanked the right division, forcing it to retreat, while a bayonet charge dislodged the center. Disaster was averted at 6 p.m. when Washington directed Greene to move his division to the village of Dilworth to form a rearguard to allow the rest of the army to withdraw. This was successful, and by 8 p.m. the army had escaped. Darkness prevented a British pursuit. Washington fell back, and again Howe paused to forage. The pursuit began on September 13th, as Washington tried to block Howe only to be outmaneuvered. Howe marched into Philadelphia on September 26th to find it devoid of government officials and devoid of supplies. Howe was surprised to learn that the Continental Congress had left for York and intended to continue fighting. This left him no choice but to continue to find and destroy Washington. Leaving 3,000 men in Philadelphia, Howe moved to Germantown with the remaining 9,000.
The one thing that the British couldn't comprehend was the government is set up in New York. We'll take New York. Government's done. Well, they fled and they went to Philadelphia. We'll take Philadelphia. Well, they're not here. They're in York. Okay, well, we'll do this, and then we'll go to York, and we'll take that. And eventually, we'll take every town that they're going to have. They could have been in a shed right here on this little mountain. It wouldn't have mattered. It wasn't about a capital. It was about keeping the people, the Congress, together, the individuals together. You keep the individuals together, and they can still run a government. It's not about taking a capital. Even today, if Washington, D.C. were taken, right, it'd be pretty difficult to invade the U.S., but let's say it happens. Let's say the North Sentinel Island, right, they get in their canoes, they come over, they take Washington. All right, well, the president and most of those people are gone. They're in the mountains now. They're probably in Wyoming or, Colorado. As long as the people are alive and can still control things, then it doesn't matter. Now, I do understand that this is the old days where taking the capital meant something. That's like a siege. You take that capital, you've won. That's checkmate. But that's not how we ever operated. The cities were kind of fluid. Yeah, we wanted to be somewhere, but we were 13 individual states. We all had our own capitals. It was vastly different.
Realizing that Howe was outnumbered and exposed, Washington resolved to attack. Washington intended to launch a multi-pronged surprise attack at dawn, as he'd done at Trenton. His regulars under Sullivan and Greene would advance in 2 columns to attack the British from the east and north before dawn on October 4th. The militia was divided into 2 flanking columns to sweep around and attack from the rear. Howe was actively searching for Washington and had placed the men in Germantown in defensive positions with extensive pickets and patrols in the countryside. However, just as at Trenton, the Continental Army's night march was undetected. Unfortunately, the darkness ruined the column's coordination, with wet roads and dense fog slowing the advance. The now piecemeal attack wouldn't begin until after dawn. Sullivan's column arrived first and successfully pushed through the British lines, to Howe's immense surprise. Fortunately for the British, 120 soldiers barricaded themselves inside the stone-walled Chew House and successfully drove off repeated Continental attacks. This caused Sullivan's brigades to become separated in the fog. Running low on ammunition and confused, they began withdrawing. Meanwhile, Greene's column had arrived and pushed the British back, but the thick fog was made worse by the gunsmoke now covering the town, and Greene's attack became more confused than Sullivan's. The militia columns missed the battle completely. By this time, the British had recovered from the shock and were advancing against the Americans, so Washington withdrew. The fog had saved Howe from potential disaster. Howe and Washington continued skirmishing until mid-December, when snow finally forced both to enter winter quarters. Howe's campaign had successfully captured the rebel capital, but had strategically failed by not destroying Washington's army, compounding the results of Burgoyne's campaign. Burgoyne arrived in Quebec City on May 6th with Germain's orders to Carleton concerning the invasion plan, to Carleton's outrage and horror. As a governor, he should have been in overall command, with Burgoyne as the field commander. However, Burgoyne was assigned total command, with Carleton simply in support. Worse, Burgoyne was promoted to lieutenant general above Carleton. Carleton correctly saw this as an insult from Germain, and in retaliation, refused to allow Canadian troops to participate. The horror stemmed from disbelief. Burgoyne was with Carleton during the counterattack that drove America's Quebec invasion back to Ticonderoga in 1776, and knew, or should have known, that the region was an untamed wilderness, with sparse settlements due to harsh terrain and food scarcity. Preparation for the campaign went poorly as well. Burgoyne had roughly 8,000 regulars for the expedition, and intended to supplement that by recruiting 2,000 loyalists and 1,000 native allies. However, as the start date approached, only 250 loyalists and 500 natives had appeared. Worse, Burgoyne acquired less than half the supply wagons he needed, and was so short of horses that his Brunswick dragoons had no mounts. Despite the shortages, by June 13th, the army was assembled at the northernmost point of Lake Champlain and sailed for Ticonderoga on the 14th. The Continental Northern Department, under Major General Philip Schuyler, was aware that Burgoyne was planning something, but not what. The northern defences were purposefully undermanned due to supply problems. Fort Ticonderoga's fortifications were expected to hold the British long enough for reinforcements from New England and Lower New York to arrive. Additionally, Kosciuszko and his engineers had surveyed Ticonderoga in May, and recommended that the fort's defences be extended outward to include Sugarloaf, a hill from which contemporary artillery could reach the fort. But newly arrived Brigadier Arthur St. Clair rejected the idea. There was a more pressing threat to the west. The indigenous tribes were split between those supporting the British and those supporting the Americans, to the point it had broken the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy apart. The British-aligned tribes were increasingly raiding western New York and Pennsylvania, so Schuyler ordered Fort Stanwix to be refurbished and garrisoned. Burgoyne reached Fort Crown Point on June 30th. Effective screening by his native allies prevented American scouting. skirmishing began on July 2nd, and the Americans withdrew from Mount Hope before it could be cut off and captured. That afternoon, the British reached Sugarloaf, discovered a route to the summit, and began building a battery. The Americans quickly discovered this, and realizing the fort was now indefensible, as Kosciuszko predicted, retreated on July 5th. Burgoyne pursued both columns, catching but failing to destroy both, and they rejoined Schuyler at Fort Edward. Meanwhile, Burgoyne paused to regroup. For reasons unclear, rather than pull back to Ticonderoga and continue to Lake George as planned, he'd march overland from Skenesborough to Saratoga. Schuyler ordered Kosciuszko to block the road south, destroying bridges and causeways and damming streams to slow Burgoyne. Meanwhile, the Mohawk expedition, led by Colonel Barry St. Leger, had failed. Despite besieging the reinforced Fort Stanwix on August 2nd and decimating a relief column on August 6th, he retreated on August 22nd, when Major General Benedict Arnold fed a local loyalist false information about the size of his approaching relief force. The damage to the existing roads required Burgoyne to build a new one, which prevented him from advancing on Fort Edward until July 24th. The fort was abandoned, and Burgoyne's supplies were low. Worse, the countryside was rapidly turning hostile. His native allies were indiscriminately raiding while scouting, killing loyalist Jane McCrea, which Burgoyne left unpunished. Despite learning on August 3rd that Howe had left for Maryland, Burgoyne pressed on with only a mile of progress per day. He sent nearly 1,000 men to raid Bennington for supplies, only for the force to be attacked and annihilated by Vermont militia. This defeat, combined with Burgoyne's disdain for his native scouts, caused most of Burgoyne's indigenous allies to abandon him. Meanwhile, Schuyler had been replaced by Horatio Gates, who wanted a direct confrontation. Bolstered by militia outraged over Jane McCrea and reinforcements from Washington, he marched north to Bemis Heights, just south of Saratoga, where Kosciuszko was preparing new fortifications. Burgoyne learned of St. Leger's retreat on August 28th. He was now alone, and had to either immediately retreat to Ticonderoga or make it to Albany before winter. Unable to admit defeat, he chose the latter, crossing the Hudson on September 13th and moving towards Saratoga, making contact with Continental scouts on the 18th. The morning of the 19th was shrouded in fog. Arnold, commanding the American left flank and suspecting an imminent attack, sent Daniel Morgan's riflemen as a reconnaissance in force to Freeman's Farm. There they found the British advancing on Bemis Heights in 3 columns, intending to engage the main body before flanking around the hills to the left. Firing from cover, the riflemen picked off every officer in the advance company before scattering the survivors with a charge. The rest of the center column forced Morgan back to the trees, where Gates sent reinforcements. Morgan's riflemen picked off British officers and artillery crews, almost breaking the center. However, the flanking columns arrived and nearly enveloped his position. Only nightfall saved the Americans, without improving Burgoyne's strategic position. That night, Burgoyne's War Council decided to attack again on the 21st. That plan was shelved when a letter from Clinton arrived. He'd learned of Burgoyne's predicament and intended to attack up the Hudson within 10 days. Thus, the council decided to wait for Clinton to arrive. Meanwhile, supplies were rapidly dwindling, and militia and Continental reinforcements were making their way to Bemis Heights. By October 4th, it was clear that Clinton wasn't coming. As Burgoyne felt retreat was disgraceful, he opted to try and break out once more. By this point, attrition had reduced his effective army to 5,000 soldiers against Gates's 12,000. On October 7th, Burgoyne led a reconnaissance in force of grenadiers, Hessians, and light infantry to the American left flank. In response, Gates ordered 8,000 soldiers forward to meet them. At 2 p.m., the British grenadiers started firing on the Americans, but it was ineffective due to the terrain. An attempted bayonet charge was routed when the Americans fired at close range. On the opposite side, Morgan's riflemen swept aside the light infantry and began tearing apart the British right. Brigadier Simon Fraser was mortally wounded leading his men, which caused the entire force to break and flee towards their redoubts. Suddenly, Arnold appeared amongst the Americans. Removed from command after a not unjustified shouting match with Gates, he arrived to personally lead an attack on the redoubts. The attack on the center failed, so Arnold rode across the battlefield in view of the enemy to lead the successful attack on the leftmost redoubt, during which his horse was killed and Arnold's leg shattered. That night, Burgoyne abandoned Saratoga and retreated.
Arnold was 75, 76, maybe he's into 77, 75, 76. He was the MVP the first few years. He was so good. And it's upsetting to know that he did get screwed over. Some things were justified, yes. But there was one, I read a book about his life, and there was one battle in particular. He was on a horse, and a bunch of soldiers, Americans, were retreating. And so he's trying to get them rallied up. Come on, no, turn, attack. The British are behind you. What are you running to me for? They're behind you, turn around. And of course he knew they were retreating. So he gets on his horse, and he sees the British coming over this field, or over this hill, spurs as the horse, and just pulls a sword, and just starts screaming, "Ah!" as he's charging at these guys. These guys come over the hill, and they just see a guy charging at him with a sword on a horse. And they're like, uh-oh. And they just stand there, and they realize, okay, load up the rifle, take a shot, doesn't do anything. And they realize, oh, we've just made him mad now. Like, at first he was probably suicidal, but now he's mad. And they just screamed, and some threw their muskets and just took off running. And the Americans that were there were like, this guy's crazy. I could follow that. And they did. It's just so upsetting to see how he turned, and then how his life just changed, and he got in his own head. And it's too bad.
Back to his crossing point on the Hudson, only to discover the fords held by militia. Now surrounded and with no hope of rescue, Burgoyne surrendered. The news was greeted with jubilation throughout the United States and France. The morale boost was desperately needed after Philadelphia, while Franklin and Vergennes finally had the victory necessary to begin negotiations. In London, Burgoyne was faulted for his overconfidence, while Howe was condemned for abandoning Burgoyne. However, this scapegoating covered up Germain's failure to coordinate the war, which was now clearly being lost. However, this was all cold comfort to Washington's soldiers, forced to endure a brutal winter in Valley Forge. We will cover that in our next video in our series on the American War of Independence. To ensure you don't...
Alright, we're going to go ahead and end this here. It was a little bit shorter because that sponsor took up a couple minutes, but that's fine. We're going to end it here. I love this stuff. Oh, I love this. I don't know all the details. I'm not one of those people that can sit there and pick apart. Oh, no. He went 9 feet to the left, and then I don't know the intricate details of the war. But I love it. All right, so we're going to end this here. I've said that, I think, 3 times now. You're tired of hearing it. But I'm going to jump back into the next video. I'm going to try to jump back into this series. So until next time, have a good day, have a good night.